related improvements that are critical for our community. And so essentially we'll hit off that conversation, but I just want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Mueller, who is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. She's also the director of the graduate program in community and regional planning at UT Austin. Dr. Mueller has been involved in housing advocacy here in Austin for years. She's also a co-author of the Uprooted study looking at gentrification and displacement pressures in Austin, and has been a strong voice for both preservation and affordable housing in Austin. So thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Mueller.
Thanks, Avais. So let's get started. I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of our panelists. The Project Connect initiative differs from prior efforts to develop transit in Austin in important ways, I think. And today we're going to focus on the ways that equity goals are being built into the initiative and how we will make sure that these efforts bear fruit. This is a new approach, certainly for Austin, but also to me, my knowledge, more broadly. This is not common. It's kind of breaking new ground, and there's a lot to unpack here and think about. So here's the plan for the session. I will briefly introduce each of our four panelists one by one as we go along and pose a question or topic to them. Each of them will speak for between 7 to 10 minutes, which is very short, but just to put out there some main points. We will hold all questions until everyone has spoken, but you can submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, usually at any time. When the speakers are done, I will ask the panel as many of your questions as we can get to in the time we have, and I'll try and start with the most common themes that are coming up. And we will finish by 6:45 to avoid Zoom brain, or Zoom fatigue. The session is being recorded and it will be posted on the Facebook event page. And we will also post any resources that are mentioned today during the discussion on that same site. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Alex Carner. So Alex is an assistant professor and a colleague of mine at UT in the Community and Regional Planning program. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Dr. Carner's work aims to quantify the social equity, environmental, and public health implications of transportation projects and plans by using emerging data sources and developing new open source methods. He has a deep commitment to practice in his research and teaching. He routinely collaborates with community members in his work with nonprofit organizations and also with public interest law firms to identify pressing research needs and improve conditions in communities experiencing transportation disadvantage. And I could go on, but I want to get to what he has to say. So Alex, to frame our discussion today, talk to us about how to think about equity in transportation. What are the key issues that we should focus on in order to produce an equitable system?
Great, thanks, Liz, for that prompt and introduction. Can everybody see my slides? Great, okay. So I'm gonna dive in and give folks a sense of how I think about transportation equity and some of the questions we should keep in mind as we start to think about Project Connect's potential equity impacts. So I'm gonna start with the kind of basic definition of transportation equity. We first realize that transportation equity or transportation planning decisions influence how easily people can reach opportunities. So planning decisions include decisions about where and what type of transportation infrastructure to build. Those types of decisions affect how easily people can kind of move throughout a region, access employment, education, healthcare, and social contacts. In the transportation research, we refer to that concept as accessibility or access to opportunities. Transportation planning decisions also affect the kind of spatial distribution of health and environmental burdens. So things like air pollution, noise, and visual intrusions. If we take a look at the existing system, we can see that non-drivers are heavily disadvantaged. They are very limited in their ability to reach the destinations that they need to lead a meaningful life. Non-drivers are also more likely to be people of color and low-income people. These same populations are heavily disadvantaged by the existing system, largely because they tend to live near heavily traveled roads. So through my work on transportation equity and my research, I'm interested in bringing about a new state where everyone has access to the transportation resources they need to lead a meaningful life, and no one is overly burdened by these kind of health and environmental burdens. In order to achieve this, we have to ensure that non-drivers, people of color, and low-income people enjoy increasing ability to access key destinations with every incremental planning decision that we make. Project Connect is no exception. I did want to point out, though, that the ability to reach destinations goes beyond just the level of public transit service that you have access to, and encompasses other questions related to policing, fare evasion policy, and just really thinking about how different types of people are subject to different risks of violence and incarceration when they're in public spaces. So if someone has access to a certain public transit system or other means of transportation that they don't feel safe using, then it's actually of little use. Now, these aren't just kind of lofty academic ideas. They're actually enshrined in various federal laws and regulations and executive orders. So I often go back in my research to Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that requires anyone who receives federal funds to not discriminate in their distribution of those funds. So thinking about who is benefiting from various public policy decisions. President Clinton in 1994 signed an executive order, 12898 on environmental justice, that did a number of things that brought low-income people into the fold. So Title VI was all about race, color, national origin. Executive Order 12898 talked about low-income people. It also talked about making sure that minority populations and low-income populations, in the words of the executive order, were not denied the benefits of policies and practices. So we have to make sure that benefits are flowing to people of color and low-income people according to these laws and executive orders. So when I think about transportation equity, I talked about this kind of idea of benefits and burdens. So I'm often thinking about how, what types of benefits and burdens we're considering, right? So thinking about these ideas of accessibility, air pollution exposure, et cetera. There's also a very important piece around public participation and process. So thinking about how best to involve the public in decision-making, making sure that that involvement is meaningful, right? It's not just pro forma, but the people that are engaged in a particular process have the ability to affect the ultimate decisions that are made. And we actually need both of these pieces to achieve transportation equity. So we need effective participation to understand what are the right benefits and burdens to address in any given situation. And even if our process is perfect, a plan can still have unintended effects that we actually need to get at with some kind of analysis. So I don't have that much time, so I just wanted to talk about a few different measures and metrics that we might consider as we're thinking about evaluating Project Connect's impacts. So I'm just going to focus on the benefit side because that's kind of the thing that most people think about when they're thinking about public transit. There are lots of different ways to measure the benefits of public transit systems when we're thinking about these ideas of accessing opportunities. I've kind of arranged them here in terms of a hierarchy from the kind of what I would consider to be the kind of least useful, potentially least sophisticated to the most sophisticated and most useful and illuminating. So we can start at the bottom here just by counting the number of people who live near transit stops and stations, or thinking about the number of stops that people have nearby to their homes. Those measures are very basic because they don't actually take into account how frequently public transit arrives or where it can get you to. The next set of measures tries to get closer to that. So it's looking at how many things you can reach, how many jobs you can reach within a certain amount of time, how long it takes you to get to nearby grocery stores or reach parklands. You can think about lots of different kinds of destinations here. Those actually take into account the level of service provided by a transit system, how frequently it comes and where it goes. And then I really like this last set of measures too, where we're actually looking at how the characteristics of trips change from an existing system to a proposed system. So looking at things like walk time, wait time, total time on transit vehicles, and how many transfers you have to incur. And you can actually use existing information about how people are traveling on public transit to understand how their trips will change. And there are lots of different ways to summarize these results that I won't go into detail about, but I have some thoughts about it if folks want to talk about it. But you can look at neighborhoods, you can look at population groups. So thinking about like low-income neighborhoods is different from thinking about low-income people in Austin, regardless of where they live. And those are going to give you different results. So just a few recommendations to close. I would encourage folks engaged in thinking about Project Connect's equity impacts to calculate a lot of different measures that are responsive to public input. So thinking about matching the measures to the needs of particular population groups. So maybe grocery stores or access to healthy food is really important for one population, but it's less important by public transit for another, and access to employment is more important for those folks. I want to caution against calculating one measure and saying that that is, the be all and end all, right? The number of people within a quarter mile of frequent transit increases with Project Connect. Well, that's not all that meaningful because it doesn't actually tell us a number of things about why transit is useful. I think any plans need to be adjusted in response to the findings. So rather than just kind of checking the box and saying like, hey, we did it, we did the equity analysis, it's all good. Think about what those findings are telling you, do the analysis early and often, and then use the results to actually inform later decisions to the extent possible, given the constraints of the plan itself. And then this last point, I think it's really important to identify how existing users of public transit will be affected by the plan. So looking at existing ridership patterns, looking at how different properties of trips will change under Project Connect, I think is really important. There's always this instinct to focus on new users, the number of new users that will be drawn into the system. But the people who are using public transit now, before it got a $7 billion injection of new funds, are the people that have been making the system work for a long time, and they deserve to be, they deserve an equal share of the benefits from the project. So those are my high-level points, and I'll yield my time and look forward to the discussion.
Great. It's amazing, an academic who took less time than was allocated. So our next panelist will be Ann Kitchen. Ann Kitchen represents District 5 on the City Council in Austin. She is very involved in transportation issues in that role. She currently chairs the city's Mobility Committee. She's also the vice chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee. She's on the board of the Capital Metro Policy Board. She serves on the Campo Board, which is our regional transit planning agency. And in relation to Project Connect, she sponsored a resolution in the spring to initiate addressing anti-displacement in Project Connect. And she helped with the development of the contract with the voters and the interlocal agreement. So Councilmember Kitchen, can you describe the elements of the contract with the voters for Project Connect that are designed to address equity concerns?
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be part of this discussion with all of you. What I want to do is I'm going to describe the framework that we have right now. And we all know, and part of this discussion is that there's a lot of work to be done to implement it. There's a lot of work to be done to measure its effectiveness and success. And that requires community voices and participation throughout this. So what I want to do is describe for you what's the framework? What were we thinking about when we put this together? And there's two parts to that. One part is the framework, the equity framework that's built around the use of the $300 million for transit supportive housing strategies and anti-displacement. And the other aspect is just the system itself. And where does it go? How frequent is it? And how does it help people have access to transportation? So let me cover that last part first, because both aspects of this are different than what we've done in the past. And I think that Project Connect makes a real commitment to equity, and it creates this framework to ensure that we achieve equity. So in terms of where does Project Connect go and what does it do? I mean, it is designed to be a citywide transportation system with a range of options for people. And that's the commuter and light rail, but it's also improved bus service, bus rapid transit, neighborhood circulators, park and rides, metro bike. So it's designed to be a whole range of options so that people all over the city can participate and can get to where they need to go. So with that said, a couple of things about it. It really does focus on parts of town where we really need to improve access to transportation. So there are the placement of the lines and the type of services are really important. So for example, there are nearly 250,000 Austinites living in our most underserved Black and Brown communities that are going to see an increase in access. I'm going to give you just a flavor of that without going into all the details. But we're looking in terms of improved service and better facilities. So for example, we have had gaps in our service areas in Northeast Austin and around the Wells Branch area. So this reduces those gaps. It also provides for faster and improved bus service in Colony Park, in the Eastern Crescent, in the Technis Center, Runberg, Cameron Road, and Dove Springs areas, all of those areas. It also, the pickup service is really important. I want to emphasize it. What that is it's on-demand neighborhood circulator. So it helps us, it helps people who are in neighborhoods that may not be configured well for a big bus or not enough people for a big bus to call and call the pickup service and get a ride to nearby grocery stores and things that they need to get to, as well as to rapid lines and other bus lines. So that's a really important part of this. So for example, we are looking at one in the Colony Park area, which might help with connections to the Expo Center and the Delco Center park and rides, and to the Metro Rapid that's going into place there. So that's some examples. The other thing, of course, is better facilities. I mentioned the park and rides at the Delco Center, one at the Travis County Expo Center also. But we're also looking, I mean, as you mentioned, Alex, the experience of riding the bus is critical. Frequency, of course, but the experience itself. So bus stops, and in our city, shade is very important. So improving our bus stops is a part of this also. The other thing I mentioned at the beginning is the routes are placed near affordable housing. So there's nearly 56,000 households designated as affordable housing that this serves. And these were, so our new bus and rail routes were intentionally located within a half mile of existing and proposed affordable housing communities. So let me turn now and give you the framework. I want to talk about the framework for the $300 million investment in transit supportive housing. And what that is this is, we recognize that the city has made a commitment in our Austin Strategic Mobility Plan to, as part of our planning process, to address issues around displacement and gentrification, and to recognize that those are potential issues for any transportation project, and we need to plan for and mitigate and address them. So what we put in this plan is, Liz mentioned the contract with the voters. I want to say a word about that. That's really important because that is binding. It is the resolution that Cap Metro passed and the city passed. That's the binding contract with the voters. And what I mean by binding, I mean is it sets from a legal perspective what you have to do with the $300 million, and it cannot be changed. So the strategies that are in there, the couple of things to understand is that we're talking about neighborhood level strategies that are created with the community using using an equity assessment tool. And those strategies, there's a whole range of those strategies. And again, what is appropriate for a particular area has to be developed with the folks that are living in that area. So the strategies can include new affordable housing, preservation, repair, rehabilitation of existing affordable housing, financial assistance for home ownership, rent, home repair, right to return, and then any kind of strategies that build economic mobility and opportunity. So that is what is laid out as the framework for those strategies. And again, I want to emphasize that these are not strategies for the city to dictate. These are strategies to be developed with the communities. There's also public accountability built into this process, and that's a public accountability through the equity assessment tool, through a public performance dashboard to measure progress as well as results. And then there's also a community advisory committee to monitor equity and anti-displacement programs. Now, the community advisory committee is to be created for the whole program, the whole system. and to look at equity issues and progress across the whole system. Not just the use of the 300 million. So I wanted to be sure and emphasize that. So the other thing is that there's a lot more detail in the contract with the voters. There's timelines in it, requirements related to when this process is developed. And those are designed to make sure that what we are doing is putting strategies in place up front, not after we have built a new system, but before. And that is really critical to this program also. So, so that's what I want to emphasize what Liz had said before. This really is an unprecedented framework. We have not seen this level of investment in other communities that go along with a major transportation system investment like this. It's up to us, though, as a community to make sure it works, to make sure that the framework that we've set in place is implemented, that we actually do hear community voices, that we actually set up a process, and as Alex talked about, the importance of effective participation in a meaningful process. So it's up to us as a community to make sure this works. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. There's a lot of work to be done. And I know you all will be at the table as you have been. And I want to thank others in the community and others on this panel that have been very helpful throughout this process. So,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Kitchen. Our next panelist will be Avais Azar. Avais is a doctoral student in community and regional planning and a teaching assistant at UT Austin. His research focuses on how racial justice can be operationalized in relation to housing and land use planning, but he is, most of you probably know him more for the many things he does in the community. So he currently serves on the City of Austin Planning Commission, on the Executive Committee of the Austin Housing Coalition, the Advocacy Committee of Housing Works Austin, the Membership Council of the Austin Continuum of Care, and is on the Board of Directors of Equality Texas. So Avais, there have been many public conversations about preventing displacement in recent years in Austin, offering many recommendations for how the city should act. Can you remind us of the themes that have emerged across these recommendations and talk about how the city is trying to respond?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the great conversation. As you mentioned, there's been a lot of work around anti-displacement, both from task forces and work that have been done on the city side, but also work that have been done from the community. So the Uprooted study was done most recently. The People's Plan is significant for the work that it did. The report from the Anti-Displacement Task Force that have been created by the city, the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism and Systemic Inequities, our Fair Housing Action Plan, so now we have regional plan, and then Austin's plan to end homelessness. So when they were all combined, I think the city's housing staff had looked at, there were around more than 300 recommendations. So one of the first things was really going through them and working on which did they think the department could actually work on most, like in the current moment, and work on the fastest, and also understanding which ones would be most impactful, combining with a lot of what they had heard from the community. One of the things that the city has done is, so we now have essentially a anti-displacement officer in Nefertiti Jackman. We have staff in our housing department that is working on this issue. And folks might know or do not know, but in October, our housing and planning departments merged. So we do no longer have the neighborhood housing and community development department and the planning and zoning department. We're going to have a housing and planning department. And it seems like as that merger has happened, staff is considering very seriously how to combine the anti-displacement work around both housing and what housing staff have been doing and what our planning and zoning staff have been doing. So I think what we're going to see moving forward is a more robust effort to address these issues and work on some of these recommendations. So one of the things that the city staff did, was it put together essentially a displacement mitigation strategy. which was really focused on 15 key strategies that were prioritized from among these more than 300 recommendations. And it was based on a sort of a robust engagement with some of our community partners. It was work that was also done with the Innovation Office and organizations such as, Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, Go Austin Vamos Austin, GAVA, our own housing staff, BASTA, so Building and Strengthening Tenant Action. A lot of those folks work together to sort of work on how do we prioritize among these. And there's 15, which I'm not going to go in detail on what they are, but they really run the gamut of what should be focused on. So there's a support that we're giving to homeowners in relation to ensuring that they can stay in place, trying to figure out whether we can provide them home repair funding and sort of support that. How do we make sure that there is greater engagement from the community in some of the investment and work that our housing department is doing? Also, to make sure that we have more robust tenant protections, we actually further tenant organizing and have those as important parts of the work that we do, and then also provide a robust tenant relocation assistance. And I know a part of this conversation under COVID has been just rental assistance that we're seeing is now continuing to the end of the year with the understanding that that might be considered in the future as well. At the same time, I think there was a lot of conversation on how do we land bank in gentrifying areas, whether that was to create land trust or other forms of homeownership mechanisms to create more deeply affordable housing. So housing at the 20% and 30% MFI range. So really deeply deeply affordable housing. How do we really, and then there was a lot to do with how do we make sure that the housing that we have, we market it better so that it goes to where we want it to go. And then also whether we could actually try a preference policy related to who could live there. So essentially residents who have longer ties to Austin, how do we make sure that they're the first ones to benefit from this affordable housing and get to be there? So I think essentially, again, right, we're looking at home ownership, we're looking at rental housing, a lot of programs streamlining, ensuring gentrifying areas and residents who are more prone to feel the pressures of displacement can actually benefit from programs. And then also, I think looking at how do we increase our support for and capacity building for community development corporations and really focusing on how do we have more engagement from community members, not just in defining and guiding policy, but engaging in actually constructing housing, managing housing, and really putting units on the ground, as we have been seeing with a lot of our community development corporations, such as the Blackland CDC and the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development CDC. So I'm just going to stop there because there's a lot to go over. I think the only thing I would say is, what Anne had mentioned, this $300 million for anti-displacement, that will become part of these strategies. And that's one of the key things that currently housing advocates and social justice advocates work with council on this deeply over the summer and before that to ensure that this money can be used more broadly and based on a neighborhood needs assessment and with community input so that it can really benefit people in the way they think they need services and support right now, which I think is truly one of the most exceptional ways of spending this money, which we have not worked on before. So I think that's going to be exciting moving forward.
Thank you, Avais. And our last panelist is Yasmin Smith. Yasmin is an attorney and born and raised Austinite with degrees from St. Ed's and from the UT Law School. She's the managing partner of Smith & Mendoza LLC and the director of development for the Austin Area Urban League. In addition, she serves as a commissioner for the Board of Adjustment for the city and was a founding collaborator of the Black Leaders Collective and is co-chair for People United for Mobility Action, otherwise known as PUMA. In her role as co-chair of PUMA, she helped to spearhead discussion of equity concerns that should be incorporated into Project Connect, including the $300 million in anti-displacement and stabilization funding. So Yasmin, I know you were very involved in these discussions about how the community would be engaged as Project Connect is planned and built out. Can you talk about the ways that community concerns will be represented as Project Connect is implemented?
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. So as you mentioned, I am co-chair of PUMA, People United for Mobility Action. Our mission is to transform Austin so that every person has access to safe, accessible and convenient places to get around their daily needs. And we do our work through the lens of mobility justice, which means putting the person before the project, and taking consideration of everyone's different vulnerabilities and lived experiences when they move around this beautiful city of ours. And so before we got involved in Project Connect, the narrative seemed to be need mass transit, here's your mass transit, and that's kind of where the buck stopped. But through Puma efforts and following the coalition we built, which included HAC and POC, we were able to get things like the $300 million for anti-displacement and all these different nuances that operationalize equity. And what I mean by operationalize equity means using those same systems that are present and figuring out how to keep them and build equity into the very foundation of those systems, so that they can start working forward. And
Yes. I'm sorry, I was going to say, I feel like folks are having a little hard time hearing you. Perhaps you can move like closer.
Yeah, sorry. Is this better?
Yeah, that's better. If all of us mute, that'll probably help.
Sorry about that. But all of that, good for you guys, was just leading to me answering the actual question, which was how do we make sure that the community members are continuously involved through the effectuation of Project Connect. And so when people ask me that, I like to point to the equity assessment tool. Everybody is wild and crazy about the 300 million, and so am I, team. But what I am most excited about in Project Connect is the template we're building to how to do mass transit in a way that can truly help people. So what's the equity assessment tool? Yeah, well, this is a tool, right, built into the system, built into the contract with the voters, the legally binding documents of this project, an equity assessment tool that does two things. One, it tracks the equity in Project Connect. And two, if it's triggered, if something's going wrong with equity on Project Connect, it triggers a public council vote. So what that does is two things. One, these triggers that I'm talking about, the key performance indicators, how we grade Project Connect in an equity lens, those are co-created with the community. So now we get to be engaged on how we track, how we decide if Project Connect is doing the right thing. And also when that same trigger is met when, something's going wrong with equity, because this is how the community describes what equity is. When that's triggered, it goes to a public hearing, which means we can hold our council members and our policy makers accountable. And so that's one way the community is engaged when it comes to tracking equity, making sure equity stays on track. And that equity tool is also, third thing, is used for those neighborhood specific strategies for anti-displacement. So it also guides how the $300 million will be split and delegated or allocated. And all of that is done with who? The community. And it was very intentional that was set in the legal binding documents from the very creation of this project.
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask a question that's directly related to what you were just talking about, that was posted by an anonymous attendee who asks, the Community Advisory Committee makes recommendations to the Austin Transit Partnership regarding the use of the $300 million anti-displacement funding. The ATP makes the final decisions on the $300 million. Will the ATP reflect Austin's status as a majority minority city? So maybe if you could talk about what the relationship is between, or Anne, if you want to take that, between those two bodies.
Yeah, let me say first, and then others will want to speak to it too. But the Community Advisory Committee doesn't determine the use of the $300 million. That is, people need to separate those two things. The $300 million is determined, as Yasmin said, by the community at the neighborhood level. The Community Advisory Committee looks at the operations of the system as a whole and looks at how the system is being built and all those things around implementing the system. But the use of the $300 million is determined. The use of the $300 million doesn't even go through ATP. That goes to the city. But it is done, and the strategies that are designed with the community, and that's what's written into the contract with the voters.
When you say it goes to the city, do you
Yeah.
mean that the city council?
No. What I
What
mean is the contract with the voters requires that the city to create a process for the creation of the neighborhood level strategies with community members, and to create that within 6 months of voter approval. And then there's also language that requires the ATP to contract with the city of Austin to work with the community to develop these neighborhood level strategies. So that's how the responsibilities lie. And as Aves was saying, the city has created this cross-departmental body that's focused on anti-displacement, and that's the group. From a staff perspective, that's the group that'll be working with the community and to develop these strategies.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like there's two levels here. You have the community that's working on what the strategies are that make the most sense for their community. And then you also have these kind of system-wide metrics that you're tracking that will trigger some kind of public hearing where people can come out then to talk. Yasmin, did you want to add there?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ann, did I cut you off?
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to highlight that distinction and shine a light on why that's important, right? That's making sure that our front and our back are covered, right? We have something in the system, right, that tracks it, that lives and breathes in there. Those who will be on that part of the task, community members, very adamant about, again, the binding documents that describes that group is actually supposed to be community members, right? So they're in the system, living and breathing in it and making sure and watching diligently. But we also heard concerns from our community that, guys, that's been done before. We've had people that say they're going to do stuff and they're on this, committee and it doesn't happen. Not saying that that's going to happen. We're going to build the best cat we can. But we've heard those concerns and therefore address those concerns. All right, let's make sure that we have community members individually, right, in this different part of the system, creating the very guidelines and key performance indicators and tools that cat will use. So that's a really, I'm glad we talked about that. So it's a really important feature showing kind of the flexibility. There are nuggets like that all through the legal binding documents of trying to maintain every day and then how can we make it more equitable? How can we make it more equitable? And so that's just one of the ways that affects it.
There was a related question that came up about that public hearing. If a metric is not met and it triggers this public hearing, so the question is, for the public hearing that the triggers activate, is there any material power that the community has, or is it just a forum for them to talk? Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think there will be, Anna, do you want to say something?
No, you go first. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, I feel like there's two ways of working on this. One is, of course, it's a council meeting with a public hearing, and council can take action. And as community members and advocates, what we've been doing before is we have been going to our council members and asking to take action in relation to that. So addressing whatever that sort of gap is in the targets. The other one is this community advisory committee that is also making recommendations to both council and the Cap Metro board. So they will also be tracking these targets and tracking this equity scorecard. And where they're seeing gaps, they will be sending sort of concrete recommendations to council and the Cap Metro board to act on. So really, I think it's working through our elected leaders and our council members, but it is also through this community advisory committee that will be made up of community members who will be making recommendations to council in relation to these metrics and equity scorecard.
Yes, and then the thing to remember is there's multiple pieces to this. There's the just pure transportation piece of it. And then there's the housing piece, and of course they go together. But from a transportation piece, this community advisory committee looks at that. In other words, are we really improving the frequency in an equitable way throughout the city? Are we really taking care of bus stops? Are we really looking at, all those things that are built into equity, the kinds of things that, Alex pointed out when you're building a transportation system. So that community advisory committee is looking at that whole picture.
Okay, I want to move on to a question about the 300 million for anti-displacement efforts. So the question is, the 300 million displacement fund will be neighborhood specific, and Councilmember Kitchen listed financial assistance for its rent, home repair, and right to return as examples. What do you mean by right to return? And could financial assistance include fixed tax or rent for folks who've been historically impacted by gentrification? BIPOC, low income, older generation, disabled. Abbas, do you want to speak to that one?
Sure, and other folks can definitely join in. I think, there's two pieces to this question. One is the right to return. So the right to return or right to stay is a preference policy that we will be tying to our affordable housing to say, if you have historic and family connections to Austin or to a particular neighborhood, you will be prioritized for affordable housing within that area. So having access to housing or other housing related services, essentially to ensure that when we're targeting anti-displacement funds or any other affordable housing funds, they're really truly targeted to folks who have historical ties to the community, making sure that they're the first ones to benefit from them. So I think that's the important part of the right to return. And this is part of our displacement mitigation strategy. It has been part of lots of various recommendations that have come from various bodies. The other part of this, the could financial assistance include tax or rent for folks? So let's break that out for a second. Tax first. The thing with taxes, the state of Texas does not allow cities to provide essentially targeted tax assistance to taxpayers. Tax relief can be provided for seniors or persons with disabilities, so essentially, or like a homestead exemption that we have, but the city cannot provide funds to go towards property taxes. That is not allowed in the state of Texas. There's a limitation there. What we have thought about, as advocates when we worked on this is sort of what are other pieces that can go in turn. So things like utility assistance, home repair assistance, things that would still benefit home owners so that they can actually essentially pay off other things so that they can direct some of their resources towards taxes. And it's a reminder that in the city of Austin, really more than half of our taxes are going to school financing and to the state through recapture mechanisms. So it's not necessarily going directly to the city either. Those are out of the control of the city. So I think that's important to recognize. As far as rent, then yes, rental assistance is eligible. And again, so things like utility assistance, rental assistance, home repair, these are going to be defined by the community within these neighborhood level strategies. Because I think there was a clear understanding that there's a distinction between various different parts of our city. So East Riverside, Montopolis, 183, the strategies that can be placed in those places are different. And so we're leaving the door open for the community to define what is their need for their neighborhood and how to best serve that. So yes, rent will be on the table, other things will be on the table. Sadly, taxes are, we have a limitation through state law.
Okay, so we're almost at time. I'm just going to ask one final question, and that's about the cost and the impact on local property taxes. The question is, clarifying question, how long will the yearly 4% tax increase last? And 4% is the estimate currently of how much it would affect the overall property tax bill for the average homeowner. Until the proposed transit system is completed, or will that be a constant tax increase? This was one concern when talking to other folks about voting this on Front A. Anne, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll answer. I think we have till 6:45, so we have a little bit more time. So, but it's okay. We can talk more. So, all right. So on the this is a tax rate election because it's designed to address implementation and operation and maintenance and state of good repair, which means replacement. So the tax rate amount was set at an amount that goes on into the future to both build and operate the system. It doesn't mean that it'll be exactly the same amount every year. It could be less because of the relationship between the tax rate and the valuation of property. So you wouldn't be thinking of it as 8.75 cents on top every year. That's not the way it works. You put 8.75 cents in once and that's it, because it's built into your tax rate going forward. So you don't add it every year. Did you want me to speak to the amount? I can't remember the rest of the question. I apologize. Do you want me to speak to the amount or?
I think the question was basically, if I'm interpreting it right, it goes up this 4%, and then it's not that it goes up 4% every year, but no, that 4% it continues indefinitely.
It goes up once, and then it's built into the tax rate into the future. So it doesn't. So any amounts on the tax rate going up in the future, first off, we're capped under state law by the 3.5% of revenue growth. But the other thing is we wouldn't be raising the rate in the future for Project Connect. It's all built in this one time.
Okay. Abase, did you want to ask a question?
Sure, I'm going to pull up one of the questions here. We've partially answered this already. I just want to make sure that we sort of really answered. And yes, you can help me in Councilmember Kitchen, you can help me as well. But how will Cap Metro choose to allocate its equity funds? And who in the community will have input and how much power will they have? So I guess just to clarify on this question, the funds are for anti-displacement related measures. And so we've answered that. But I think just to follow up on like how the equity scorecard measure will work, maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well.
So I can take the first crack at it. This question, this is the question I'm getting a lot at this phase of the game. And what I like to say is you're asking me for the tenderness of the meat, but we're at the root stage. That means that right now, as the legal binding documents have it, the $300 million is for anti-displacement, and that money will be allocated dependent on the conversations we have with the community. If you think that's a good idea, right, that the community gets to be at the ground floor providing the direction for these funds, then you have to give time to do that, right? And that is the conversation we're starting to have now, is switching gears into making that community conversation happen, where we can do the distribution and the allocation to the specific communities, depending on what that community actually wants for their stabilization. And so did that answer the question? How is it going to be given out? Okay.
And then also, what input will the community have on the equity scorecard?
So that goes back to the assessment tool, right? The community is at the ground floor creating the key performance. I'm sorry if this is jargon, but the key performance indicators, right? Like, so if you remember your report card, and all of the different lines of like what you're being graded on and all that good stuff, those are your key performance indicators, right? Like, how well did you do on your tests? How well did you do on your homework? How well did you do on class participation? And this is what, your final grade is. Those things, how you do your homework, how does the assessment tool work? How did you do in class? How many people are being displaced by this transportation? Did you turn your homework in? What are we doing for the community in regards to equity and the right of reentry? Those things are created with the community, right? And so from that creation with the community, that's how we decide what that community needs as far as stabilization efforts and money. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, it is. And I just want to also mention one other thing that I think has been mentioned, but I just want to clarify. There will be there's sort of like, we will have the equity scorecard, but there will also be a public dashboard. And this
Yes.
public dashboard will be publicly available so that all community members can be tracking everything on it at all times. And I think that is really important and exciting in terms of transparency and how we work through this. So it's not just the job of a community advisory committee or council to stay on top of it. I think we're going to need all of our, folks who are working in advocacy and grassroots and just community members coming together and really holding everyone accountable. And that public dashboard will be key to allowing us to do that.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Aviz. Again, you guys, if you look at the contract with the voters, these little nuggets of equity, equity, equity are built into every single clause, every single line, in order to make sure that it's the most transparent, that at any time, any member of our community can be engaged in this, and our community as a whole can benefit from the project if it should pass.
And our city departments will have a key role to work in this as well. So we're already, identified within it is our housing department, but also our equity office, our sustainability office. And, the sustainability office and equity office just work on the climate equity plan. So you're going to see a lot of the work that, the foundations have been made already by our equity office and our sustainability office, and we're going to build on that, including with the help of our innovation office. So really, I think it's like it's going to be a team of multi-departments, people with a lot of different expertise bringing it together to make sure that this equity scorecard is really comprehensive in nature.
The other thing to just add is that the team at the city is also bringing the transportation staff together with the housing and planning staff. As well as, the equity office, sustainability office, and the innovation office. And putting those two together, I mean, we all know how important it is to bring housing and transportation together. And that's something that's been, talked about. And, we've done that to some extent, but this really puts them together for Project Connect. Really puts those two together as we talk about both the transportation aspect of it and how that intersects with the housing.
I have a question I want to pose to Alex here. One of the questions is about the bus versus rail. It says it seems like a genuinely equitable transit proposal would focus on buses instead of rail, which would presumably be cheaper and open up funds for anti-displacement efforts. So, Alex, can you talk about kind of the mix of things in there, or how you would think about that?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely address it from like what the research shows. I did want to make a brief point about the $300 million allocation. That I think would probably be good to keep in mind. There are some really promising examples of how to allocate large dollar amounts to communities from around the world. The policy known as participatory budgeting is a really good example where you actually commit to allocate a certain amount of funds subject to a binding community vote. So folks actually come together, deliberate, create packages of different policies, different ways that they want the funding to be allocated, and then they actually get a vote on it. So when I was talking at the beginning about meaningful public engagement, I think that's one of the best practices there. So that would be something to kind of consider. On the bus versus rail question, it's certainly true that per mile, bus infrastructure, including dedicated lanes and actual transit vehicles, there's labor kind of gets a little weird, but it's cheaper per mile. I think I'm not going to take a position either way here, but I think there are a couple things that work in rail's favor. One is there's some sense in which a reasonable amount of rail is necessary to build political support for the measure and for the plan. The bus in the history of US transportation planning has been a kind of problematic mode, and it's simply the case that a lot of folks don't see themselves on the bus where they do see themselves on rail. And I think that itself is problematic, but it's nevertheless true. So having rail in the plan, I think, can bring in voters who might not otherwise vote for it. So I think as a political matter, it's important. And then rail vehicles have higher capacity potentially. So if, as Anne just mentioned, I think that this plan is quite unique in actually bringing together transportation and land use. Usually you have transportation being done in one shop, and the people doing land use are actually anti-transit and don't really want to think about how to make those two things work together really well. So here it seems like we actually have that nexus. And if we do actually have that, and we're actually serious about putting people near high frequency public transit, then I think you can make the argument for the higher capacity rail system. So in this case, I think there's certainly a case to be made for rail in this plan.
And I would just add that, as you mentioned, Alex, the capacity was one of the things that that we looked at, in trying to decide if we put rail on the ballot as part of it. And the concern was that the projections showed that and I'm not going to remember the exact number of years. I can provide that if someone would like, but the projections showed that we would reach capacity very soon if we only had a bus system, because the city is slated to like double in size. And so in order to really handle the capacity that we needed, the thinking is, or actually the numbers showed us that we needed to include rail as part of it. Most of the system is rapid bus and improvements in bus service, and with some core light rail lines, as well as some commuter rail.
And I think, go ahead, Abase. I also think that when looking at the project in totality, the rail nuances foreshadow a future regional viewpoint of transportation. We're thinking about it, right? The city, just Austin, but we really have to start understanding the nuances of transportation and how we move about in a society, and especially with the project's articulated goal of the right of reentry. We have to start thinking about those that aren't necessarily in those boundaries of Austin, because not only are they Austinites who have been pushed out, but they will also benefit Austin from being able to come in and out our small businesses and things of that, our hotels, all the South by South, all those things. The ability for us to be able to have transportation in a way that's conducive to a regional approach, which is more in line with a rail than a bus system, I think is an important thing to note, as well as a benefit of why it would be mixed. But as Anne said, the majority of the project is the rapid bus and the improvements thereof, but with very critical regional approaches, north, south, east, and west, to make sure that all of those in our geographical boundary and those that have been pushed out and our neighbors are able to, go back and forth in an accessible manner.
I was just going to add to that, right? Like, this is just a personal experience moment. This is not a data conversation, but because of friends in the city, I've moved you name a place in the city and I've lived there.
Same.
But I've lived on both Riverside and on North Lamar. And I can tell you, right, like our number 20 and 7 that go on Riverside to downtown, and the 1 and 801 as they come down Lamar, it's standing room only, not only just during rush hour, but pretty much throughout the day. And, I saw folks, trying to struggle with grocery bags or with backpacks or with, childcare. And I think we can see that on these places where these corridors where we're going to have trains, we really have very high ridership as of now. So we're kind of hitting capacity. We would have to figure out how to address that. And then, as we talk about the green line that will go northeast, past Colony Park, really, I think that's been such a, something that community had asked for and worked on as part of the Colony Park Sustainable Community Initiative and their master plan for years. And, in some ways, I think the most exciting thing for me is this is the first time that rail will ever go east of 35 or even for that matter, a bus rapid system will go east of 35. For all these years, we've never had anything go in that direction in terms of these larger, more significant infrastructure investments for transit. And we're seeing that with this project. So if it passes, we're talking about rail and bus rapid going east of 35, which from my perspective is a really important equity goal that we all should have as a community.
Yeah, I think that taking that regional perspective is important, and also thinking about the balance within the system and thinking about some of the benefits that Alex talked about as ways to think about benefits and burdens up front. You know, the farther out you are, the time issue, how long does it take you to get to different things becomes harder and harder to accomplish with bus alone. So someone had posted a question also about the pickup services, the neighborhood circulators, wanting to know which neighborhoods would have access to this. Is that something that's listed online?
I can speak to that. Well, the map has, there's not a list per se, but there is the system plan map has these little round circulators on them, and they're scattered around the city for areas that are proposed. Now, let me just say that they're proposed at this point because this is another thing that is developed with the community. What makes sense for an area? Now, there are three more specific ones that we know will be first, and one is in the Dessau Wells Branch area, actually from Runberg up to Wells Branch. And so that one we know is going to be first out. There's also one that's south of Slaughter off of Manchac, and then another one in the Oak Hill area. Those three we know for sure. We're also looking at one right now in the Dove Springs area. But if you look at the map, you can see that they're being proposed for all over the city. So for example, there's a proposed one for the Colony Park area, which will particularly help people get connected to the bus rapid transit that goes out that way and address some of the issues that we've seen in the past about the bus service not being quick enough. So helping people get to the BRT line that's going to go out there and or to the park and rides at Expo Center and Delco Center with a circulator in the Colony Park area is something that's being discussed also. So I guess the bottom line answer to folks' questions is there are, well, there's three specific and another one that are being considered first up. But this is something that's another thing that has to be, that Cap Metro wants community input on. In other words, they've been placed on the system map in areas that it looks like would be useful. But it's also a conversation with those communities about what makes sense.
Okay, another question about the sort of governance of various parts of this. So who will be on the Community Advisory Committee and on the governing board of the Austin Transit Partnership, and how will they be selected?
Well, okay, I can speak to the ATP. I don't know if you guys want to speak to the Community Advisory Committee. Why don't y'all do that first?
We'll start with the board so that we can sort of talk about that, because there's some things there as well.
Okay, so the ATP board, the Austin Transit Partnership, is the entity that is created. It's a partnership between Cap Metro and the city of Austin through an interlocal government agreement. So technically that's what that entity is. It will have a 5-person board with a board member from the city council, a board member from Cap Metro, and then 3 community members. There are requirements in the interlocal agreement that speak to the qualifications of those board members. And let's see. So, and those relate to, well, they relate to experience with it's a range of things, community planning, urban planning, the community experience with these kinds of projects. So those are laid out in the interlocal agreement. The appointment of the board made jointly by the Cap Metro Board and the City of Austin Board. I think that answers the question. Do you guys want to, I mean, it's going to be critical and important that we get folks on that board that represent the representative of the community. I know y'all might want to speak to that. Someone may want to speak.
Yeah, so I think just to give, I guess, some context to some of the work that we're talking about. So, you know, People United for Mobility Action, PUMA, the Austin Justice Coalition, and our communities, we worked really closely with council over the summer on a lot of these different measures, along with a lot of the housing advocates from Housing Works, the Housing Coalition, essentially a large number of folks were working on these things. One of the things that we were very careful on and try to push for was how do we get more and more community voices on there. So, you know, one of the things on this is that what we'll see is that on the ADP board alone, we'd started out with different requirements for these community experts. And I think, you know, I thank our council members like Councilmember Kitchen, Councilmember Garza, Councilmember Kassar, who really work with the Cap Metro board to come to a position where we will have members on there who might be community experts, but will also really be ingrained in the work that community is doing, including, for example, the planning expert will be required to have deep community, you know, engagement expertise. And also council will have the ability actually to go beyond these. And if they think there's a person from the community who would be amazing or excellent for this, you know, they can be on there. The Community Advisory Committee is similarly going to be appointed by, you know, council. And, you know, if this bond is, you know, passes, that will be one of the conversations in setting up what are the bylaws, who gets to serve on it, what do they look like? And from our perspective, we're very careful about a few things that we want to see on there. I think one is we want to see a representative of our community. So communities of color should be on there. Folks who are more likely to face displacement pressure should be on there. Transit users should be on there. Folks with disabilities, childcare, and other sort of, you know, abilities that sort of make it harder for them to, you know, be a part of sort of like transit service and take advantage of it, they will be a part of it. So I think from the advocacy perspective, you know, and this has been mentioned by everyone on here, the work is not over. Even if we pass this bond, there's a lot of work to do in the future. And one of the things is, you know, the people on this call, the organizations on this call, but also so many beyond that, I think we'll be ensuring and making sure that the people that are on this Community Advisory Committee and the ADP board truly represent the voices of the people of Austin and our transit users, so that we can make sure that, you know, they're representative of the work that we're trying to do. And I know Yaz and JP, if you want to add something to that as well.
No, I think Avez, that was beautifully said, and I love the pressure a little bit that we're putting on our fellow community members. I get a lot of questions about wanting things in all the detail right now, and from my perspective, the very fact that this process has been set up a different way, right? Let's take our time. With every single move we make, let's take the time to involve the community and let the community guide, I think is a really important distinction, and what makes me so hopeful when I look at this project. So I just wanted to, I think it was beautifully said. I just wanted to highlight that part of the fact that when we're saying, oh, those were intentional steps, those were intentional measures, so that at every single point, the community is at the table and has power at that table.
There's also a question about how dashboard information will be communicated to residents that lack digital literacy or access. Have people thought about that yet? Or?
So I think that is a great question, right? Like accessibility has been a part of this conversation from day one. And like, how do we make sure that not only the system or the process by which we get to it is as accessible as possible? So these are, I think, all details that haven't been figured out on what the dashboard will look like. How do we make sure? But from our perspective, I think it will have to be accessible. It will have to be accessible to folks for whom English is not the first language or not their primary language. And I think also for folks who might have other kinds of lack in ability, whether they can go online or just digital literacy. So I think those details have not been figured out, but I think that is definitely on the mind of everyone involved to make sure that we have truly accessible, not just the dashboard. The dashboard is one piece, but really beyond that, how do we make sure that this entire process is extremely accessible? And from my perspective, I think the Community Advisory Committee will play a key role in making sure that this scorecard is not only tracked and looks fine and give their input to staff, but also ensure that they're the ones who are raising up the voices of the community, sharing the information with them, and making sure that it's effectual.
Okay, we just have a few minutes. I just want to say one thing myself, and then I'll turn it over to Avais to close the session. To me, one thing I want to hear more about moving forward is how the community planning will be done, so that communities can really work to identify what the things are that they need in their communities, before things move along too much and the impacts really begin to be felt in terms of anti-displacement. So it's exciting that planning and housing have merged together and that they have this anti-displacement team now. But I know that's something I'm going to be following up on to learn more about and help them think about it if they want any help on that, because I think that's critical. That's going to be really critical in building the capacity of communities to have a meaningful voice in that process.
And that assessment tool, which is really cool, which I really liked about our coalition building, there's a timestamp on that, right? We're not making, these aren't just promises and sound bites. These are in legal binding documents, and it's not when we get to it, it's 6 months. So if you're looking to be part and engaged in this process, this is the time. You have your community members here, your community leaders here who are working on the ground with this. And it's going to continue to change and evolve. Because that's what equity is. It's not something you put a rubber stamp on and you're done. It's something you do every single day. And while I don't think any of us can guarantee perfection, because when you do something revolutionary that has never been done before, you can never promise that. But what we can promise is that we will stay here exactly where we are, and every single day, as we've done every single day from this point on, ask ourselves and push ourselves to make Project Connect continuously be more and more equitable, be the best project that it can be.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I just want to say, thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank Councilmember Kitchen, Dr. Mueller, Dr. Carner, Yasmin Smith, Chapala Conley, definitely our co-host, Austin Justice Coalition, and also the team at Housing Works for, I think, helping put this together. So thank you all so much. I think the one last thing that I'll leave with before I pass it on to B is, we're focusing on this as being one aspect of it. There was going to be a lot more, whether it's tax increment financing, directing our affordable housing funds towards anti-displacement measures, building more directed work towards, ownership. And so I think this is just one sort of key piece that is part of this larger system that I think the city is working on, and that I think our community has been pushing and asking for. So I think this is sort of that synergy of coming together, and I just appreciate the work that everybody here has done on this. So with that, Chapala Conley, I'll pass it on to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avais. And I won't take up people's time because I know that we're at time here, so I don't want to bleed over too much. I just wanted to say that, from the Austin Justice Coalition's perspective, not speaking for any of the other groups who are here on this call, but we really have chosen to support Prop A and to ask the community to vote for it. I know that this conversation is really about digging into the nuance, but our attitude towards it has always been, in the work we've done with Puma, with planning our communities, our attitude has always been, let's vote for it, and then let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Is it going to be what we need it to be? It will be if we make it so. Now, if we sleep on it, and if we don't stay engaged, and if we don't keep on top of what's happening, then I'm not sure that it will be, but we can make it what it needs to be for us if we put in that sweat equity. And, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But what we can't afford to do is just kick the can down the road, and constantly, make the better tomorrow the enemy of the good today. You know, I mean, if we had put in this infrastructure investment 20 years ago, we would be in a very different place right now. So, you know, that's my plea to everybody. Like, I am absolutely willing and able to critique this. And I think some people here who are here on this call have heard many critiques from me. But I also think that, you know, if we don't get this passed, then all of the time and labor and love that has already gone into this from activists and community organizers will be wasted in a sense. And we'll have to, you know, dream about maybe having this conversation again 2 years down the road or something. So anyway, thank you all for taking time to join us. And I hope that we can have many, many more conversations like this in the coming months and years so that we can get this right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank y'all.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank y'all.